Is the Arctic territory of Greenland a part of North America? Let's join Professor Robert Rix from the University of Copenhagen to trace the long history of settlement in Greenland.
First time human foot was set on Greenland is 4,500 years ago. So these would be Paleo-Arctic people who entered from what is now Canada into Greenland. They were there on and off, and there was a number of people that we know about, the Dorset, the Thule people, and some of them would be ancestors of what's now as the Inuit indigenous population there. These were nomads, so they would travel, they would have hunting grounds, and they would move from place to place. So depending on whether it was summer or winter, they would go to different places in Greenland. There would be some places for an extended period of time, but then move on, depending on where they could hunt. So that would be the case. Basically, the only inhabitable parts of Greenland are the coastal areas. So these are ecological pockets, and you can do a little bit of farming there, as the Norse people would do, and you could live there sort of rather comfortably. But climate was extremely important, because when we get to the Middle Ages and the first sort of Norse settlements in Greenland, they would come there because they could farm the land. And this was during the medieval warm period between 950 and 1250 approximately. So this would be a welcome climate at the time. And part of the reason why the Norse people left Greenland was also because it got increasingly colder in the 13th century. According to the sagas, we know that the first person to really take an interest in Greenland was a very colorful character called Erik the Red. He was an Icelander, and he was accused of murder. He got into other squabbles, and at one point he was banished from Iceland. And he sought out this place in Greenland, a place to settle, as he was banished for 3 years. And he thought this would be a place where I could establish a new colony. So part of the propaganda exercise, he sold this as the Green Land. And the sagas are quite clear about this, that this was to attract other settlers to come to Greenland. So this is in 986. This is the year in the sagas given for Erik the Red settling on Greenland. This led to quite expansive Norse settlement from Iceland in Greenland. No official colony of that sort. It only comes later, because the Norwegian king takes an interest in Greenland. 1261, King Håkon Håkonsson establishes Greenland as some kind of protectorate. It's little unclear from the sources what this meant. But if we take the parallel of Iceland, we know that this was really guaranteeing shipping routes, which would obviously be important for trade. There may also have been some kind of protection. There was a number of English pirates who came there to fish and also to loot the coasts of Iceland. And presumably something similar could have happened in Greenland. At least there are stories told about this. We know that pirates did come to Greenland's coast and looted and presumably also kidnapped people. In the early 15th century, there is a record of one of the leaders in Iceland was kidnapped, and he was in an English prison. And he writes a letter to the English king at this time, arguing that really the English pirates had wreaked havoc in Iceland. And we also know that at least 8 Icelandic children were traded as slaves in Norfolk in 1429. So maybe not raised on these stories, but we can find documentation that pirates did come to Greenland. From Greenland. They are fishing, they are hunting. Farming was also part of their trade, and that may have been a little more difficult as the climate got increasingly colder. They had Eurocentric ways. That might have been something that accelerated their exit from Greenland when it became a little colder. We also know a little bit about, from archaeological digs, the fashion they sported at the time, which was a European fashion. So they still kept in contact with mainland Europe throughout the colony's existence.
Eventually, the Norwegians establish a crown protectorate over the area.
This becomes part of the story of the Danish possession of Greenland. Because what happens in 1397, which is known as the Kalmar Union, is that Queen Margaret I of Denmark establishes some kind of countermove to the Hanseatic League. So these commercial and defensive network of merchant guilds and market towns in Central and Northern Europe. In order to counter that, she establishes a Nordic community. So basically the kingdoms of Sweden, Denmark, and Norway are united, and they're under the Danish succession. So at that time, the Norwegian overseas colonies are transferred to Denmark. And that becomes really the origin story of why Denmark is now in possession, or why it's a part of Denmark today, because of that. The unification of Norway and Denmark, continues obviously after the Kalmar Union becomes defunct. until 1814, Norway and Denmark, they are United Kingdom under the Danish crown. And when Denmark has to cede Norway to Sweden in 1814, following a defeat in the Napoleonic Wars, it's quite clear in the Kiel Treaty at the time that the overseas colonies, Norway, Iceland included, will still belong to Denmark. The communication with the settlers in Greenland discontinues after 1410. The last record we have of the Greenland colony is a ship leaving in 1410 after a wedding in the eastern settlement. And after that, there are no records of any communication with Greenland. We simply don't know what is happening there. And it leads to all kinds of speculations. One speculation is that they've all been killed because at this time, maybe it's important to emphasize that when Erik the Red came to that southern part of Greenland, it was empty land, so it didn't take the land from anyone. But over the centuries, the ancestors of the Inuit moved down from Canada to reach first the hunting grounds in the north and then later to the settlements in the south. And we do have records of skirmishes between the two peoples. So there could have been some violence involved, which would have made life even more difficult in the Greenland colonies. Pirates, the climate, overfishing is also a possibility. After 1410, there would have been a colony there, but it probably would have discontinued around 1450, maybe a little later. We don't know how it came to an end. That these are the bombastic visions, dystopian visions of all the Norse Greenlanders dying from the cold or from starvation. Probably didn't happen that way. This was a time when the plague was in Europe, and lands would have become available in Norway and in Iceland. So presumably, some of these Norse Greenlanders just thought, well, there's a better option for me back in Iceland. And they might have hitched a ride with a boat and went back to Iceland. There are several attempts to reach Greenland, but because of internal and domestic problems in Scandinavia, it doesn't actually really happen until the early 1600s. So King Christian IV launches 3 expeditions to Greenland, and this is basically to reclaim Greenland for Denmark. And it's still with this imagination that these rich colonies full of gold, full of resources, and resources must really be the headline here, because as we move on, this will also be a theme or through line in much of what significance for Europeans is resources. But this time, Christian IV is interested in finding the eastern settlements because of resources, because of trade. But that is to say, presumably fishing would still have taken place in the intervening years. When Denmark establishes a colony in 1721, there are several boats already trading with the indigenous Greenlanders. So when the Danes come, they realize that especially boats from the Netherlands have systematized trade along the coast. And that becomes a real problem, and also a spur for the Danes to re-enter Greenland, because they need to get a check on this trade, thinking that this is our land and we need to profit from it. So in 1721 is the recolonization of Greenland. It's quite a disappointment, this fantasy alive, that just beyond the horizon, there's gold. There's something to be found. There's this kind of the forests of Greenland described in the old texts will still be there. We just need to reach that eastern settlement. Go back to Christian IV and his early 17th century expeditions. This was really brought on by the fact that Martin Frobisher, the English explorer, had reached what is now Canada and brought back what initially was thought to be very precious metal, but turned out just to be completely valueless, or that had no content in it. It is a competition at this time. It continues to be so. Certainly the Netherlands, also Britain, would vie for possession of Greenland, especially Greenland waters. And whaling, it becomes increasingly important. And we must think of the Greenland waters as some kind of modern-day oil field, because whale blubber is such a commodity that it is something that you would really do anything to gain access to these waters, because whale blubber is used for lamps, for oiling machinery. So it becomes an industry at this time to find whale blubber. And this is also what you trade with the indigenous Greenlanders. But whaling becomes so important at this time. So it's this European competition. And everything the Danes do is to curtail any kind of other European involvement in Greenland and Greenland waters.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.